Okay, here's your icebreaker question to get you started. Have you ever had a friend help you to make a good decision? Have you ever had a friend help you make a good decision and share the story with your group? When you're ready to dive into the scriptures, you can press play on the video. We're up to Romans chapter 8 now, and as we're diving into this section, Paul is starting to talk about the application. What are the implications of all these things we've been talking about? We've been talking about law, law of God versus law of sin and death. We've been talking about things like obedience and righteousness and holiness, which leads to life, and things like sin, which is separation, and that becomes immorality or impurity, and then that leads to wickedness, which leads to death. And so we were talking about all these things, and now as he dives into chapter 8, he's really starting to get into what's the implication of that. What does it mean for us as we get into this, and especially how we are able to cross the line from sin and death back over to the realm of life with the Spirit. And that's something that we could not do without Jesus. So this first passage that you're going to read here from chapter 8 is starting to talk about how Jesus sets us free from the law of sin and death and brings us into the realm of the Spirit, the law of the Spirit, as he says. So read that, talk about that. How does Jesus do that, according to Paul in this passage? And then we'll dive into the next section in just a minute. As I explained on Sunday, Paul is starting to use a new set of terms for comparing and contrasting sort of one side of the line versus the other side of the line. He's been using terms like sin or separation versus holiness, which is separation from sin and closer to God. He's been using words like obedience and righteousness to talk about on the side with God. He's been using things like impurity and wickedness on the side that is separated from God. He's made it clear that we cross the line when we rebel against God, when we break God's law, and we are separated from God and we can't get back. But when Jesus comes along, we can get back to the other side, the side where there is life. Now he's introducing a couple of terms that are talking about those two sides of the line again, but the words are different, and that's because they're going to have an implication here, which we'll get into in just a minute. But right now, it's the words are flesh and spirit. And the word flesh is just a literal translation would be like skin and bone and so forth. But Paul is not saying that our bodies, our human bodies, are bad or evil or wrong, that there's something bad about being human. What he's saying here is he's just using these terms as a comparison contrast term so that he can start talking about the Spirit and what it means to have the Spirit of God and to be able to walk by the Spirit. So right now the terms are flesh and spirit, and they're really referring to the side of the line that is called the law of sin and death, and the side of the line that is referring to the law of God, that is the spirit side. And my question as you read this passage is how is Paul communicating that to us in this passage? In other words, what links flesh to the law of sin side of things, and what is linking the word spirit to the law of God side of things in his discussion that he's had up to this point. So read that. Talk about what are the linking terms there. He gives them to us in the sentences there. And then we're going to go a little bit further and talk about the implications of the Spirit. Paul starts to focus on the spirit now side of things. And he's not just talking about following God's law, but he's starting to talk about a person, if you will, that is there to help. The spirit starts to become more than just a demand that we have to follow, but the spirit starts to become a picture of God being there as our helper, as our counselor, as the one who strengthens us, who gives us whatever we need in order to follow the law of God and to fight against the temptation to cross the line. God's spirit, when Paul switches to this terminology of flesh and spirit, is starting to move us out of the idea of I am alone trying to do what God tells me to do, to a realm where I am together with God and we are walking together doing what God knows is best for me. Because I'm talking with God, I'm listening to God, and I'm using the wisdom that God gives me and the strength that God gives me to go through each day here, walking by the Spirit. Now, this all assumes that you and I have the Holy Spirit of God. And Paul says, if you don't have the Spirit of Christ, you're not even a Christian at all. And so, how is he so confident that we all have the Spirit of God? How do we know that we are in the realm of the Spirit? How can we be sure that we have the Spirit of Christ, the Spirit of God, dwelling inside of us? Paul is very confident of this. How can we be confident of it as well? Talk about this with your group, read that passage, and we'll go on to the last section when you're ready. Well, Paul's been writing for a while now and bringing in all kinds of imagery. He's been talking about law of God or Moses and the law of sin and death. He's talked about flesh and spirit. A while back there, he talked about slaves and masters and how we sell ourselves into slavery. Now he's saying we're set free from slavery to things like sin and death, and we are walking by the Spirit. And then he brings in a term to tell us the implication of all of this. If we have received the Spirit of God, then we have been identified as children of God. Not only receiving the Spirit, but people will see us and they will recognize that we are children of God, not because we show off with like spirit gifts, but because the Spirit produces fruit in our life. People see a difference in us because of the Spirit of God. Read this last section about us being the children of God, and then talk about that. What is this passage saying about us being children of God, and how will we be identified by other people as children of God? What are the things that will show them? How will they know? How will we be called children of God? Then go to your time of prayer together with your group. Pray for one another that all of us will walk by the Spirit, that we will all be identified by people outside of us, friends, family, neighbors, co-workers, that they will see us and recognize that we are children of God. Pray for me also, that I will be that kind of a man, and know that I'm praying for you, that God will dwell in you, that his Spirit will begin to bear fruit in you, and will continue a good work in you, so that all of us will be called children of God. God bless.